Natalie, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to our program, Vikings, Fearsome Raiders, and Adventurous Traders. We're delighted to welcome back our presenter, Ellen Green, who is joining us from London. The library is grateful to the Friends of the Glencoe Public Library for supporting this visiting professor's event. And now let me tell you a little about our presenter. After working as a field archaeologist in London for 5 years, Ellen Green returned to academia, where she recently completed a PhD at the University of Reading. She specializes in bioarchaeology with a focus on ancient burial practices during the late Iron Age and early Roman periods in England. Much of her research is finding and examining human and animal remains found in odd places. This is her 9th program for us and the 5th that she has generously allowed us to record and keep on our YouTube channel. Since 2016, Ellen has brought us fascinating lectures on London archaeology, Roman London, industrial archaeology, historical cures and quackery, sacrifice and ritual in Iron Age Britain, warrior women, dogs in the ancient world, and what can be learned from skeletal remains. Ellen, it's really nice to have you virtually in the library once again, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Natalie, for that wonderful introduction. I'm particularly excited for this talk because I want to talk to you about my very first excavation I went on at the age of 17. So I was still in high school. I was interested in archaeology, and I asked my parents if I could go on an archaeological dig, and they very kindly said yes. And at the time, I was also starting to look at universities, particularly universities in England. One of the universities I was looking at was the University of York. And in the city of York, there happened to be this program called Archaeology Live, where you could sign up and do an archaeological field school and dig on a site there. And this site just happened to be quite an important site for looking at Viking York. It was a site called Hungate. So my very, very first dig, which absolutely made me fall head over heels in love with the process of archaeology and excavation, was actually working on Viking remains. So I hope that I can share some of the magic that I experienced when I went to York with you today. So the Vikings, I think more than any other culture, are really, really omnipresent in the sort of cultural consciousness today. When I say Viking to you, what you're probably thinking of is a big strapping man in armor, probably blonde, blue-eyed, bearded, possibly wearing a horned helmet. That depends on, where your references are, because I think we are starting to drop that one now as a Viking image. The Vikings did not, I'm afraid, wear horned helmets. That's a very weird stereotype that actually is from German opera. But I do have to say it makes a very striking image. But even more so than just the idea of the Vikings, we've got TV shows about them. We've got Viking superheroes. Thor is based all on Viking mythology. And even in places you don't necessarily expect, you find the Vikings sort of there waiting for you. So I'm sure all of you have Bluetooth and use it on your phones all the time. I know I do. The name Bluetooth actually is taken from a Danish king who was famous for having a rotten tooth. And when they made Bluetooth the device, they actually took the rune that he used to use for his name, and that is the symbol that you see when you start your Bluetooth. So, the Vikings are kind of always there, sort of on the edge, I think, of our cultural consciousness, and they mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. When we're looking at who the Vikings actually were in a historical and archaeological sense, it's best to use lots of different strands of evidence. If you've been to my talks before, you'll be used to me giving this spiel, but there are so many different ways of looking at the past. It's sort of important to think about which ones we use and what specifically they can tell us. So archaeologically, we have loads of artifacts, both those that have been found nicely in their contexts by archaeological digs. And also, we get a lot of finds that are sort of chance finds by metal detectorists. There was a very interesting case a couple years ago about a young girl that managed to find an intact Viking sword in a river, which is pretty impressive. This particular picture that I have here is the excavations at Coppergate, which was one of the largest Viking excavations that have ever taken place in England. We sort of dig up their settlements, we can see how they live. And obviously, we also have the skeletons of the people themselves, which can be incredibly helpful for understanding their health, their diet, migration patterns, and also their beliefs about death and the afterlife. But the Vikings are really handy because they also had writing systems. And not only did they have their own alphabet, the runic alphabet, but they interacted with a lot of other people who wrote about them. So we have accounts from 10th century Islamic traders who talk about trading and interacting with the Vikings. We have the Anglo-Saxons who are always writing about the Vikings and generally how much they don't like them. We have the Norse sagas themselves that have been passed down through oral tradition and then get written down later, which can be incredibly illuminating, particularly for looking at Viking voyages. I'll be talking about Leif Erikson a little bit later, but we know about him primarily from the Greenland sagas. And we also have the interesting sort of phenomenon of place names. So if you look at a lot of place names in Britain, particularly in the north of Britain, they're very Norse. And this is because of Viking influence. And sometimes, even when you can't necessarily find the actual archaeological remains, this gives a hint as to where the Vikings sort of have been. So I did some work this summer on the island of Islay in the Hebrides in Scotland. And there have been almost no Viking sort of remains found on the island. There have been a few burials. But interestingly, quite a few of the place names on the island are Norse, and they're Norse for things like Olaf's Farm, which was actually the name of the site that I was working on, Alista. And this tells us that the Vikings probably were settling there and were sort of intermingling with the local people. And this gives us an entirely new window, even without digging, or even if we aren't necessarily digging in the right places. So when we're talking about the Vikings, just to sort of orient us in time and space, we're generally talking about the 8th century to the 11th century. In England, maybe really only to the 10th, unless you want to talk about the Normans who invade in 1066. But the Viking world is absolutely massive. So, you know, I think when you say Viking, people just think of this little bit of Scandinavia here. But if you look at the map, they're extending out with massive settlements here in Eastern Europe, settlements in England. I'm going to talk quite a lot about Viking England during this talk. And Greenland and Iceland up here, and of course, Finland, which as well, I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. And when we look at the Viking world, it's absolutely astounding just the sorts of distances some of the items are traveling that we find. So these are just some examples. This coin, which is inscribed in Arabic, is from sort of the Middle East or North Africa. It's from the Caliphate. It was found in northern England. It's a 10th century coin. You know, down in Constantinople, Istanbul, you get this graffiti in the Hagia Sophia. So one of the most important churches in Istanbul during the period. And it's Nordic runes that say Halfdan. It's also really interesting because it's in one of the upper balconies. So there's some thoughts to be had about why a bored Viking might have been standing up there. In Viking York, we have found an amber working workshop where they were making amber beads, but amber comes from the Baltic. You know, you don't get amber naturally in England. And then we have this little guy down here who's actually my favorite. Last summer, I went to visit my friend who lives in Stockholm in Sweden, and we went to the museum, and they, of course, have a large exhibit on Vikings, as you would expect. And I remember going to a case and going, this is in the wrong place. Why is there a statue of the Buddha in this Viking exhibit? Well, it's because it was found in a Viking grave. And they think it was made probably in North India or Pakistan, and it was found on a tiny island in Sweden that had a Viking graveyard on it. And this must have traveled absolutely mind-boggling distances to end up in that grave. And it probably would have been quite a treasured possession to end up in that grave as well, despite it not necessarily being made of precious metal. It was copper alloy, which is still valuable in the Viking Age, but maybe less so than some other metals, as we'll discuss. So when we're talking about the Viking world, both in terms of space and time, I think it's important to keep in mind that it is a huge area, and that what is true in one area might not necessarily be true throughout the entire Viking world, and that there are generally exceptions. But it is just mind-boggling to me that it is this big. The other thing I really want to point out, which is not super easy to see on this map, but all of these areas inland are on major rivers, particularly the Volga River. That is because the Vikings were so successful, largely because of their boat technology, which was absolutely amazing for the time. So this is the Osberg ship. It's actually a ship that was recovered from a burial in Norway. It had two women interred in it. We don't actually have sort of any ships, or many ships rather, that aren't from funerary contexts, because shipwrecks are quite difficult to find and are not always very well preserved. But what we do know about Viking ships is that they had these shallow keels. So the keel is this bit sort of here. And shallow keels were really important because they not only allowed boats to pull up directly onto the beach and to navigate rivers, but they also allowed the Vikings to do something called portage, where people would actually get out and lift and carry the boats from one water course to another, which again gave them access to all of these rivers sort of in Central and Eastern Europe. The other really interesting thing about Viking ships that I want to share with you is about, again, a part that we almost never see preserved, which is the sail. So Viking ships mostly worked off, sail technology. You would have also had people on oars, but the reason they were able to cross such vast distances was primarily due to wind power. And these sails would have been made of wool, and they would have been woven. And doing experiments to see sort of how long it would take to make a sail, archaeologists have found that it would have taken 3.5 years with no days off to make one sail for a Viking longship. So the amount of work that went into the sails is absolutely astounding, and it probably would have been the most valuable part of the ship, despite all the other very important parts that went into it. And I also want to point out how beautifully decorated the Osberg ship is. I mean, these are not only practical items, but items that had a lot of craftsmanship go into them as well. So when you think about the Vikings, the first thing that probably comes to your mind is violence. That's not an unearned reputation, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. And what actually kicks off what is known as the Age of Vikings is the raiding of the church and monastery at Lindisfarne, which is an island in the north of England, also known as Holy Island. This is a description from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. I'm rather fond of it because of its sort of portents before the Vikings attack, the amazing sheets of lightning and whirlwinds and fiery dragons seen flying in the sky, and then a famine. And then finally, the Vikings come and they destroy Lindisfarne, and they take away both a lot of material goods and a lot of people, primarily women. And there's a lot of slaughter and robbery. And this is actually the picture of the Vikings raiding Lindisfarne from a illuminated copy of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And you can see no horned helmets, but they are in these very fabulous boats. That's Lindisfarne there in the middle. So after the raiding of Lindisfarne, this kicks off a whole period with tons and tons of raiding, particularly of monasteries in Ireland, in England, in France, really up and down the coasts, as well as raiding sort of, again, down the rivers in Central Europe. And it also led to a very interesting policy of you could pay the Vikings off to not raid you. So in France, the Vikings actually settle Normandy because the people there give them some land in exchange for them not raiding the French coast. And in Britain, a lot of the Anglo-Saxon kings would pay something called the Dane Geld, which was literally a price to stop the Anglo-Saxons raiding them. So again, when we think about Viking warriors, I think we all have a very specific mental image in our heads. And I'm going to actually talk about a Viking graveyard at Berka, which is an island. It's not very far from Stockholm. If you're ever up there, I really suggest visiting it. It's a lovely site. There's a fortified settlement and then a graveyard, and they've done a really lovely job of setting up a museum there. And Berka's arguably most famous grave is this one, which is what is generally considered a very archetypical warrior grave. It was excavated in the 19th century. It contained a single individual here, lying on their side. They had a sword, they had an axe, they had knives, they had arrows, they had spears, they had 2 shields, 2 horses, some lovely board gaming pieces. The board gaming pieces are quite significant because often board games are associated with strategy and strategic learning, and they do tend to be found in these warrior graves and in the graves of leaders. And for 100 years, there have been papers written about Berka BJ 851 talking about this as, the very masculine ideal of a Viking warrior. Except, surprise, when the osteologists looked at the bones in the modern era, they said, hang on a minute, this pelvis looks rather feminine. And then they did DNA, and they found out that the Berka grave was actually genetically a woman. And the reason I'm using this grave as an example is really, it just makes us sort of rethink our preconceptions about what Viking raiding parties would have looked like. We know from the sagas that shield maidens did exist in Viking society. And also, if you look at Viking mythology, Valkyries are very present. A lot of these older graves, they're going back now and starting to do DNA testing and to sort of test these assumptions. And quite a few of them have been female. So when we have that stereotypical hyper-masculine idea of Vikings, that's very much something I think that has come through sort of ideas passed down from the Victorians rather than necessarily what is archaeologically true. One thing I really like about the Berka warrior burial actually is her cap, which I just want to point out. It had these sort of silver tassels on it. And they're very similar to ones that have been found in Ukraine. And again, we have this idea of materials moving quite far to end up in these graves. So while we're talking about Berka and items moving very far, let's talk about the sort of trade routes that the Vikings used. So we know that the Vikings didn't just go in and steal whatever they wanted. We have accounts, particularly from the Arabic trader Ibn Fadlan, who was a 10th century writer who talks about the trading with the Vikings. We know that they often learned Arabic in order to communicate better with the people they were trading with. And their trade networks were astounding. So in Berka, I think one of my absolute favorite things that was found was actually this. And I know this looks really unimpressive. It looks like brown, decayed cloth. That is silk. And it probably wouldn't have been brown in its heyday. Soil staining often turns textiles this very uninspiring mud color, but we know that the Vikings really liked bright colors from where we have been able to do dye reconstructions. The thing that's really impressive about this silk is that silk must have come from China. During this time period, that's where silk is being made. And so we know that the Vikings are trading with people along the Silk Road, and they are getting things that are coming from literally the other side of the world. And there were quite a few scraps of silk found at Berka. The Vikings were surprisingly actually very snazzy dressers. As you can also see from these beautiful French dress clips down here, they're made of enamel. And again, were found in Berka. They're hugely colorful and have traveled quite a way to make it to Sweden. But these two artifacts, which again have traveled a long way, the ring is from the Middle East and the jug is from sort of Central Eastern Europe, again, probably sort of near the Ukraine area, are really interesting because they both have religious symbols on that are not necessarily the religions of the Vikings. So this ring is actually one of the only sort of inscriptions we have of this type from the Viking era, and the sort of gemstone is inscribed in Arabic with the phrase "for Allah," and it's not incredibly easy to see on this picture, unfortunately, because of the angle, but this jug actually has crosses and a cross motif all the way across the bottom. Now, we don't know if the Vikings that these grave goods were found with necessarily followed these beliefs. We do have instances of Vikings, of Christian Vikings, certainly in England. And it's not that big a leap that they might have interacted with these religions and that some of them might have converted. But equally, these graves are quite typical for Viking graves, and they may just have liked the items. It's an interesting sort of puzzle, really, why they would have had these items. But certainly, they're beautiful items in their own right. And again, it really sort of shows how far these things are traveling to end up in this graveyard in Sweden. So the Vikings had this vast trade network. What did it run on? Well, the Viking economy basically ran on silver. And the really important thing about silver was not necessarily coinage specifically, but its weight and its purity. So the Vikings really, really loved the silver coins that were used in the Caliphate in the Middle East and North Africa because they had a really high purity rate. And it's really normal when you're looking at Viking silver, either found in hoards or in graves, for it to have all these little nicks on it. You can kind of see on some of these pieces here. This is the Vale of York hoard, which is currently in the British Museum. And those nicks were made with a knife to prove that the silver was pure and it wasn't just a coating. The other thing they used to do with their silver is create something called hack silver. So the Viking economy, they didn't use coins. They liked silver coins because they're a source of silver, but they often cut them up, as you can sort of see here. And you can see this silver brooch has been cut, and this is a close-up of another bit of silver brooch that's been cut from the same hoard. It's that one there. They often cut up items that actually had sort of everyday uses to use as hack silver to buy things. In fact, the sort of Eastern Vikings, the Rus Vikings, had arm rings that were specifically sort of designed to have bits. Just you'd take it off, you'd cut off what you needed, and you'd put the arm ring back on for easy trading. But it's kind of amazing to me, some of the items that they use for hack silver. For instance, this brooch is gorgeous. It has very typical Scandinavian knotwork on it. This design, you might know it as Celtic knotwork. That's such a misnomer. It actually is sort of early medieval, and it comes in with the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. It's sort of Germanic and Scandinavian in origin. And it's beautiful and it's very intricate. And this brooch was almost certainly used as a decorative item before somebody chopped it up and decided to use it as hack silver. And again, you can see where somebody's stuck a knife in to check the purity. The other thing that was really important to the Viking economy, and I think it's worth remembering because there is a habit of deeply romanticizing the Vikings, because there are quite a lot of very interesting things about their culture that might make them seem more modern to us, that slavery was very important to their economy. When they did these raids, they not only took stuff, but they took people. In Viking society, slaves were called thralls. There's actually some evidence that they were occasionally sacrificed during funerary rituals, and these are people that wouldn't really have had any rights. So the Vikings had this great reputation for being extremely good fighters, and they were in general a very well-traveled people. So it's really not that surprising that other cultures maybe made contact and wanted to hire them as warriors. And because of this, you get the Varangian Guard. So the Varangian Guard is a group of Vikings that operated as a special unit in the Byzantine Empire. And it's founded in 874 with this treaty between the Rus, who are the Vikings that are over in that Eastern European area, and the Byzantine Emperor at the time. And from the 10th to 11th century, it's primarily Scandinavians. And the idea behind the Varangian Guard was that these are people from outside the Byzantine Empire that aren't going to have sort of political machinations, so that the emperor can trust them. And they were legendary for their ferocity. This is a quote from some Byzantine sources, talking about how frightening the Scandinavians were, and that they had this sort of berserker attitude to them, which is really interesting. We know that they were generally armed with axes and shields, as you can see in the drawing here. And they probably seemed a little bit barbaric to the Byzantine Empire, which very much, of course, was the child of the Roman Empire. And actually, it's the Varangian Guard that probably is to account for that Viking graffiti I was talking about in the Hagia Sophia, because the capital of the Byzantine Empire was Istanbul, and the Hagia Sophia was a very important church during the Byzantine Empire. But the Vikings didn't just raid and trade, they also settled places or occupied them, depending on, which turn of phrase you prefer. And I'm mostly going to talk about Viking England here because it is my comfort zone. I'll probably pepper in some Scottish sites, but it's worth keeping in mind that there are huge swaths of Europe that this happened in. So in England, you get something that's called the Danelaw, which is this bit here, which really covers about half the kingdom. It's quite impressive, as well as you get settlement on a lot of the Western Scottish islands, a little kingdom in Dublin, and the Isle of Man. So what happens is that at some point the Vikings send in what is called the Great Army, which is a large group of Vikings that are not there just to raid, but to actually take land for settlement. And it's really interesting because we have a cemetery associated with the Great Army. It's actually one of the only sort of confirmed formal Viking cemeteries we have in England. And it's in a place called Heathwood, and it's associated with the Great Army. And it's a cremation cemetery, and they were looking at some of the remains in it. Now, it's quite normal for Viking burials to include animals, horses and dogs in particular. There are lots of reasons for this, shows of wealth, companionship, and there's some religious reasons as well. But they actually did something called isotope testing, which is where you look at the chemicals in teeth and you can see where someone, or in this case, where dogs and horses grew up. And they found that the dogs and horses had been brought actually from Scandinavia to England, which is pretty impressive. I mean, Icelandic ponies are not huge, but they would take up a lot of room on a boat and it would be a lot of resources, similarly feeding a dog over a sea voyage. And this shows, I think, that they really are coming to settle and they're bringing with them sort of their homes. Now, the Great Army comes in 873, and their main camp is in a place called Repton, which is here on the map. Repton is part of one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the Kingdom of Mercia. It's quickly conquered by the Vikings, and they make this camp here. This is a recreation of it. And the camp is really interesting, again, for looking at this sort of process of Viking conquest and settlement, because previously they're just raiding and going away, and now they're choosing to stay and overwinter here. Now, you don't really do battles in the winter in England because the weather is absolutely freaking awful, and it's just not very practical, really, to be moving armies around. But the Vikings in Repton are not sitting around doing nothing. We have actually a lot of evidence of craft work going on in the camp, particularly metalworking waste and things like these. So these are clinker nails. Clinker nails are great because there's really only one thing they're used for, and that is shipbuilding. So we know that they're making these nails and they're repairing their ships. They're probably repairing weaponry, and they're really sort of preparing the army for what's to come. Now, what we also found at Repton was some interesting funerary evidence. So first of all, I'm going to talk about this mass grave here. This was found in the area near the church. It was buried very deliberately under a mound, and incorporated into that mound was rubble from the Anglo-Saxon settlement that would have been there. So it's very much, I think, a power play. And this grave contained, at minimum, 264 individuals. What's really interesting about this grave is that it's what archaeologists call a secondary burial. So these aren't actually whole bodies. They are parts of bodies that have probably been brought from elsewhere. And we actually think they may have been some of the people who fell sort of during the campaigns that the Great Army was waging that are brought back here to Repton for funerary practices, for funerary interment. And it's really quite interesting. Other interesting things about this grave is that not all the bodies are male. There were some women in there, whether those represent local women who were taken captive, thralls that were brought with the Vikings, or warrior women. We don't really know. It's very hard to tell. But we did do isotopes for quite a lot of the Repton burials, and almost a large portion of them are Scandinavian, so I think it is fairly safe to say that they were Vikings. But what's really interesting is that some of them actually appear to be from somewhere with a warmer climate than England. So the thing with isotopes is you can't always exactly pinpoint where somebody is from. Has to do with the geology, and unfortunately a lot of Europe has quite similar geology. But there is this implication that some of them may actually have been Mediterranean mercenaries that were hired or joined on, which is quite interesting. At Repton, there were also two incredibly nice warrior graves that were individual internments. This is one. They were both male. One was older and one was younger. They're quite nice. You've got a sword here, and a hammer of Thor as well, pendant. Interestingly, he also had a boar's tusk put between his legs. this may have had some symbolism because the body had some quite impressive cut marks on the hips, and it might be possible that he lost some of his anatomy shortly before death, and that this might be some sort of symbolic replacement. We don't know. But what is interesting about these two warrior burials is that when they ran DNA, not only are they both Scandinavian, and they certainly look, again, these ones do fit your stereotype. They were both blonde and blue-eyed, although this guy was probably slightly balding. But they were related. So they were either father and son, which is the most likely scenario, given their age differences, but they could also have been half-brothers. They're important enough that they were given their own burials, again, with grave goods, not terribly far away from the mass grave. So it's very likely that they were some sort of leaders. And there have been some attempts to identify who they might have been using the sort of sagas and written accounts of the Great Army in Repton. But it is really impossible to say for sure who they might have been. But I don't want you to think of the Vikings just as aggressors. The Anglo-Saxons did, in fact, fight back. So the St. Brice's Day massacre happens in the 11th century, and what happens is that the Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred decides that he doesn't want to play the Dane Guild anymore, that this is a complete waste of money, and he actually orders his men to round up Danish settlers and kill them. Now, we have lots and lots of historical accounts of this happening, but for a long time we didn't really have any archaeological proof. But in, I think, 2009, they were doing some repairs to St. John's College in Oxford, and the archaeologists who dug it found this mass grave. Now, this was these actually were primary inhumations, so they were full bodies. They don't seem to have been laid out with any sort of respect. They do just kind of seem to have been thrown out there. And there were at least 35 individuals. Of the ones that you could get sex estimation off of, because you can't do sex estimation with individuals that haven't gone through puberty, they're all male. And they're all aged sort of from 12 up to 45, with the majority being sort of in the 20-25 range. They radiocarbon to about the right dates to be Vikings and to be part of the St. Brice's Day massacre. And it is very likely that these are the victims of St. Brice's Day massacre, again, given that they are mostly men of fighting age, or they're probably all men, generally, of what would have been considered fighting age. And when they did do, again, the isotopes to sort of look at where these people were from, they were all pretty much from Scandinavia. Now, these guys did not die a nice death. There are severed limbs that were found, like this hand. You can see where the sword's cleanly, I say sword, bladed instrument has gone cleanly through the lower arm there. This skull has multiple cut marks from a sword. These are puncture wounds in a pelvis from a spear, and here's some in the back. Altogether, there was a minimum of 106 what we call perimortem, so injuries that happened shortly around, sort of at or around death injuries. That is an insane amount of trauma for a skeletal collection. 106 injuries for 35 individuals. It's actually quite a nasty picture, and it does really take you back, this sort of violence. Now, Ethelred's nickname was the Unready, which means badly counseled, although it can also mean unprepared. I suppose in modern parlance it is still fitting, because the Vikings were not overly happy about the St. Brice's Day massacre, and they did retaliate, and it all did go quite poorly for Ethelred after that. But in a sort of happier, less violent strain of research, I want to talk to you about Jorvik. So Jorvik is Viking York, and this is where I did my very first dig. There are two major sites in Jorvik that make up most of what we know. There is Hungate, which is the one I dug in, 2009? Yeah. And there's Coppergate, which was dug in the 70s and 80s. And York was originally a Roman settlement called Eboracum, and the Vikings capture it in sort of 866, 867. It's captured by a guy who with the best name of Ivar the Boneless. And it actually really only stays in Viking control for about 30 years. And then it goes over to the Anglo-Saxons and they have it for a little while. And then the Vikings take it back. And it sort of ping-pongs between the rest of them for the rest of the early medieval period until the Normans take it when William the Conqueror invades. And Jorvik is really, really interesting for a couple of reasons. The first is that one of its first kings was Christian. Only 20 years after conquering, it's led by someone who is known to be Christian, and given that it was conquered by the Vikings is quite interesting. And we actually have very, very little evidence for the sort of Norse religion being practiced in Jorvik. And there certainly isn't any evidence of religious tension, which is fascinating considering that there is sort of previous to the Viking invasion, with all the raiding, monasteries were such popular targets that there is quite a lot of religious tension. It's also really interesting because it tells us a lot about Viking civic planning. Now, again, when people think of Vikings, they think of raiding and pillaging. They don't think of civic planning and making your city nice. But actually, the house construction was really standardized in Jorvik, which is actually quite rare in the ancient world. It was quite nice. So the houses tended to be about 4.4 meters wide by 14.8 meters long. They would have had earthen floors. They're mostly one story. Some of them also had a basement that was cut down into the earth. You can actually see it in this recreation there, and there's another one there. Then they were actually quite nice. They would have had a central hearth. We don't think they would have really had chimneys or windows because where we have sort of better preserved examples of Nordic buildings, they don't. So the hearth would have probably served also as a source of light as well as heat, and the smoke would have come out the thatch at the top. Jorvik was also a major trade and manufacturing center. In fact, we even have evidence of coin mints in Jorvik. Now, earlier when I was talking about the Viking economy, I was telling you that the Vikings don't really use coins. England is a wonderful exception to this, and they were minting coins in Jorvik. In fact, they mint some with some very cool raven designs on. But we also have evidence of an amber bead workshop where they're making, carving amber. We have examples of lots of bone working. We have examples of leather working. I think they found evidence of a shoemaker's workshop on Coppergate. One of the really nice things about the site at Sun York is that quite a lot of them were waterlogged, Coppergate in particular, which means that we have much better preservation there than we do in other places. So, what was daily life like for the people in Jorvik, for the Vikings in Britain? Well, we know that their diets would have been pretty varied. We have found evidence of nuts and fruits, plants like dill and fennel that would have been used for seasoning. We know that they would have made a sort of flat griddle bread, which you can see. This is a reenactor making some at the museum in Stockholm. We also have this wonderful artifact. So if you're thinking that looks a little bit like a poo, that's because that's exactly what that is. That is, in fact, the largest human poo that has ever been found archaeologically. It has its own Wikipedia page. It is called the Lloydsbank Coprolite, and it's absolutely massive. The Viking who passed that was probably not having a very good day. but it's really helpful for us looking at diet. So we know that the individual that passed this was having a diet primarily of meat and bread, with almost no fiber, which probably explains some things. But we also happen to know that they had really bad intestinal parasites, because quite a lot of them have been preserved in the coprolite. So it's a very strange artifact, but it's quite interesting from an archaeological point of view. But while we're talking about parasites, what was Viking hygiene like? I mean, you think about these raiders on these ships for ages, and you might be thinking that they're dirty, smelly people. And you would be very, very wrong. In fact, the Vikings were so concerned with cleanliness, that the local Anglo-Saxons actually complained about it because the English women preferred the Vikings. So this is from John of Wallingford, wrote a historical account. He was trying to justify actually the St. Brice's Day massacre, and one of the reasons he justifies it is that the Danes are just too attractive, and the English women just can't resist them because they bathe every week, and they change their underwear. And I just find this fact great. A more archaeological bend, we also know that they cared a lot about hygiene because some of the most common artifacts we find on Viking sites are carved combs, either bone or antler, like this one here. And they often have their own cases. In fact, one of the first things I ever found when I was digging in Hungate was a carved Viking comb. Absolutely beautiful. And we just found tons of them. They were really, really common. We also know the Vikings liked bright colors. They were very fashionable people, so they really did care about their appearance. And there are some religious reasons for that, because in Norse religion, you don't know when you're going to die. It's important to always sort of look good so that when you go to the afterlife, you don't basically look like a bum. We know that they really liked bright colors. They were really into their jewelry. Men would have worn sort of leg wraps like this. Their clothing mostly would have been linen and wool, but we actually do find silk, although that would have been very, very expensive again because it would have had to come from China. These sorts of brooches are very, very common. They're quite big. They're called peninsular brooches, and they would have been used to hold cloaks on, and both men and women would have worn them. Belts, often tablet woven as well. And just to get a look at some of these sort of items. So Viking beads are a wonder. They're made from all kinds of material, from carnelian, which is a semi-precious stone you get from the Middle East, to jet, which you can really only get in Whitby, in England. Sometimes they incorporated coins that they'd taken from other places. There's some amazing glasswork you can see here. These are all from a hoard that was found in Orkney in Scotland. And this is one of those penannular brooches I was talking about. So it would have had a big needle that went across there and you gather your cloak. The Vikings had a lot of decoration, even on sort of everyday items. So most Vikings would have worn a knife. This was as much a tool as it was a weapon. You need it for sort of everyday sort of things. And these sheaths, leather sheaths, which are from York, have been beautifully preserved. And you can see how decorated and tooled they are with these really intricate sort of patterns. And this is very much just something that is an everyday item that they've taken the time to really make gorgeous. We also know that the Vikings had a sort of form of proto-knitting called null binding. It uses a single needle. And this is actually one of my favorite artifacts they have in the museum at York. It's a sock. Again, it wouldn't have probably been this brown color. As I was saying with the silk, textiles tend to get stained this very dull brown by the soil. But where we have done chemical analysis, we do know that they have some pretty fabulous colors. And you can see it basically looks like a modern ankle sock. And then we have these. So there were lots and lots of shoes preserved at Coppergate in particular. Like I said, they found a shoemaker's workshop. But one of the other things that we found um, a lot in York were Viking ice skates. And I really wanted to include these because the favorite artifact I think I've ever found was I found the blade of a Viking ice skate when I was digging at Hungate. And so the blades of these skates would have been made from the leg bones of either a horse or a cow, and they wouldn't have really worked like the skates that we wear today. You wouldn't have been able to pick your feet up while wearing them. You just would have, they're almost sort of like cross-country skis. You would have propelled yourself along and sort of slid on them like sled runners. But I just think they're amazing that they had ice skates in, 10th century York. So that kind of brings me on to my next topic, which is what did the Vikings do for fun? Well, the Vikings really liked board games, for one thing. There's one game called Nefeltafel, which was extremely popular in the Viking world. I think we actually do have the rules for it. I've certainly seen recreations in museums that show you how to play. This is a board game and some pieces that were found again in York. And one of the things about these gaming pieces is they're often absolutely gorgeous. They do range from sort of simple stones to things that are made in glass to quite fancy pieces like this. And we know that they really liked strategy games. They also had chess. So these are the Lewis chessmen. They were found on the island of Lewis, predictably, which is one of the Outer Hebridean islands in Scotland. They're one of the most famous pieces actually in the British Museum, and they are worth seeing again if you find yourself in London. They're, I think, one of the highlights of the museum. But they're really interesting. So they're carved walrus ivory, and they have a very interesting mix of iconography because, as you can see, the bishops are very much Christian bishops. You can see him giving the traditional blessing there. He's got the staff with the crook on the end. They're very identifiable as Christian figures. But if you look at the rook over here, that's a Viking berserker. You can see him biting his shield, and that's making reference to this sort of uncontrolled rage that berserkers were meant to go into when they were fighting. So it's this nice mix of different cultures sort of showing up within these pieces. This probably belonged to a very important individual. We know that there were some quite significant Vikings living on Lewis at the time, although I believe it was found in isolation. So while we're talking about things that people think about the Vikings, and of course it is a talk given by me and my specialism is human remains, let's talk about death and burial. When I say the phrase Viking funeral to you, I'm sure this is what you're imagining. A beautiful long ship, lit on fire, body on it, it's probably on the water, somebody shoots flaming arrows, it's all very picturesque and very Hollywood. The reason it's so picturesque and very Hollywood is because it probably isn't the reality, at least in the majority of cases. So where we get this idea of this burning boat is, again, from our friend Ibn Fadlan, the Arabic trader, who did witness and write about the funeral of one of the Rus Viking chiefs. And what happened with that was they did drag a longboat out of the water onto land. They laid his body on it. There is a very interesting ritual involving one of his thralls, a young woman who drinks an intoxicating liquid, gets a bit frisky with some of his friends, drinks more intoxicating liquid, and then is sacrificed on the ship, and then they light the whole thing on fire. And there are lots of grave goods that are also put in the ship. Now, this is a very interesting story. It's certainly a wonderful and evocative mental image of a very dramatic funeral, including this thrall, which who is sacrificed, but who volunteers to be the one sacrificed because she misses her master so much. But archaeologically, it's a little bit difficult to nail down. Cremations only show up in the archaeological record when they are deposited in some way into the earth, because if you just leave ashes on the surface of an area, they blow away. So we don't actually have any archaeological record of anything like this happening. We do have archaeological records of a lot of different funeral practices going on in the Viking world, though, and it doesn't seem like any one practice was the one true Viking way of death. In fact, it isn't even really consistent whether or not people were being cremated or inhumed or buried as full bodies, or indeed secondary burials like there were at Repton. And there's such a wonderfully wide range of things going on. There are lots of Viking funerals that do, however, funerary practices that seem to reference ships. So this is the Osberg ship, which is actually the ship I showed you at the beginning of the presentation from Norway. It was buried in a burial mound. It contained the remains of two women, as well as lots of grave goods. And because of the soil conditions, the ship was actually really well preserved. But we also get sort of more the suggestion of ships in some areas. So this is a cemetery in Sweden where you have these sort of outlines of ships made with stones, and then you get bodies interred in the middle. But even in this cemetery, it's not consistent. These mounds almost certainly don't have ships under. They're not really the right size or shape, but they do almost certainly have bodies in them. What does seem to be fairly consistent with the Vikings, though, is the issue of grave goods. They did generally get buried with some pretty nice stuff, and it's not unusual to find animals with them. So if you think back to the Birka warrior grave I was showing you, she had two horses with her. When I was talking about the graves of the cremations in England, where they were looking at where the horses and dogs came from, there were quite a lot of animals included in those cremations, along with jewelry and nice objects. Now, just to finish off, I want to talk about the thing that I'm sure you are all wondering about this entire presentation, which is the Vikings in North America. It's something you hear people talk about a lot in the US. Leif Erikson being the first one to discover North America. I've heard claims that the Vikings have gotten and settled in New England, in Minnesota, in lots and lots of different places. And I just want to sort of go through, because it can be quite difficult actually when you're looking at the sources to work out the sort of truth of each statement. So if we just compare these two artifacts for a minute, we've got this big rune stone, and we've got some actually very small items here, a bead, a whetstone, and part of what looks to be a bone needle or awl. I think if I sort of asked most of you which item you would find the most convincing of Viking presence, you would probably say the runestone. The runestone is a fake. It was supposedly found in 1880, again in Minnesota, and it is still in a museum. But there's been quite a lot of claims about the Vikings in North America, and quite a lot of them don't really play out. So the sort of first evidence we had of Vikings in North America are the sort of sagas, particularly the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. And these talk about Leif Erikson and Bjarni Haraldsson and their voyages west of Greenland. And they talk about a place called Helland, a place called Markland, and a place called Vinland. And see on this map where they've sort of created where these journeys go. They talk about interacting with the Native Americans, who they called Skraelings, and they talked about these places as potential sources of resources, particularly wooden furs. The only actual archaeological evidence that has been confirmed for Vikings in North America comes from this site here on the very, very northern tip of Newfoundland, in a place called Las O Meadows. It's not a very big site. It doesn't seem to have been inhabited for a long time. It seems to mostly have been a camp. And these are actually some of the artifacts that were found there. I think they're quite interesting, but again, they're maybe less impressive than some of the artifacts have been forged to talk about Vikings in North America. So you really have to be careful when you're looking at these sorts of claims and where the evidence is coming from and whether or not it has actually been verified. Because when I started this talk, I actually thought there was quite a lot more evidence of Vikings in North America than this one site, but it turns out there really isn't. Although I think it is pretty conclusive that Leif Erikson did get to Newfoundland, because the descriptions of Vinland are pretty convincing, and there is this site of a camp on the tip, which is probably where he's talking about. So thank you for listening to me rabbit on about Vikings. If you want to learn more about the Vikings, there are some absolutely fabulous books I would recommend. River Kings is a really fabulous starting point. And it was actually my sort of entry point into Viking archaeology. There's also the Forgotten Viking book, which covers quite a lot of the sort of Eastern European material. And if you're more interested in religion, I recommend Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology, which takes quite a lot of the poetic Edda and just turns it into a slightly more readable format. Thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Ellen. That was very thorough and very interesting. As she mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to drop those into the Q&A or reach out in chat if you can't see that. To start us off, I'm not sure how much you might know about this, but when you were looking into the North American Viking myths, was there anything about why they're so prevalent, or why people like kind of wanted to prove that there were Vikings everywhere?
So I think, unfortunately, a lot of it probably comes down to wanting to prove that Native American land actually belongs to Europeans. The Vikings are really interesting archaeologically, but unfortunately, quite a lot of Viking stuff has been very much claimed by sort of white supremacist movements. The Nazis were famously very fond of it, and it often gets sort of mixed up with these sort of identity movements, which can be quite unfortunate. In fact, I very much, if anyone is thinking about getting a Viking tattoo, I really suggest you do an awful lot of research before you get one, because I have a friend who had to get one removed after finding out that a perfectly normal archaeological symbol was actually used by a local hate group.
Very good to know. And another thing about the sailing technology, kind of going back to the beginning, you mentioned that the sails would have probably been made of wool. Do you know what other materials, like in terms of the supremacy of wool, like what other materials were common at that time?
I think you could reasonably make a sail out of linen. I think that in the Scandinavian climate, it would be quite difficult to get enough linen for that to be practical.
So, but like in other regions, was it linen probably the most common?
I would need to go away and research that.
Yeah.
I suspect that it wasn't necessarily wool down in the Mediterranean, but again, I would really need to go away and research.
Yeah, absolutely. Seeing if there are any other questions. I guess going back to this, because you mentioned this was something that you looked into kind of at the start of your journey in archaeology, was there anything kind of going back to it that you were surprised to learn, or stuff that's kind of been discovered recently?
Um, I was mostly taken aback. Like I said, when I went to visit my friend in Sweden, I knew about the sort of amber trade from when I'd been in York, but I didn't realize how far east the Viking trade routes really, really went. And I was absolutely floored that there were items from, India, from China, um, that were being incorporated into these graves. Um, I mean, their trade networks were larger than sort of the Roman empires at their height, and I always sort of think of that as the big one of the ancient world. But actually, the Vikings were getting things from further away, which is pretty astounding.
Mm. All right. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions, so thank you again for this very thorough and very interesting talk, and I hope we will see you again at some point in the future. So.
Thank you very much.